Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Sarah's just dropping in as well. Excellent. We're just going to wait for Luke and Sarah just to pop up and see their lovely faces. My name's Mike. I am kind of chairing or hosting tonight. You might recognise me in terms of if you're regular on the YouTube channel. If not, I'm a worker at HBP. Co-founded it with Shannon about a year ago. I'll explain a little bit more about myself in a minute. How you right, Sarah? Thanks very much for coming. Are you looking very snazzy tonight? Very official. That's good. We can't hear you though. I have to say you're not muted, but it might be your microphone or something. We'll figure it out. Yeah, it's okay. It's cool. We can work with that. We're used to it. I've already made one foible so far with the audio. Shannon's going to be kicking me afterwards because I managed to not close one window. But anyway, so just for those guys, before we get into it, for those in the live chat, as I say, if you've turned up tonight thinking that it's the weekly live stream Q&A session, then it's going to be tomorrow. It's just the way the dates have fallen. So, but this should still hopefully be very interesting for you. If you're in the live chat as well, you're very welcome to use the live chat, obviously. We'd love you to participate, but you don't have to. If you want to just stick in there what region of England you're from, and if you're really kind of keen, you can put in there a number out of 10 as to how much of a significant issue gatekeeping is in your area. You don't need to name the council, but so 10 would be gatekeeping is a serious issue. We see it all the time. 1 would be gatekeepers not much of a problem here. I know generally the further away from London you are, the better it gets generally, but it's obviously some exceptions to that. A few other bits you need to know. There's a 30-second lag for those watching, so we're not ignoring you. It just takes 30 seconds for us to see comments. Do feel free to put comments and questions into the chat. We're obviously not going to get to answer all of them, but if there's a particularly insightful question or comment, we certainly will refer to it just to help our discussion progress. And that is all I think I need to know. Don't put personal data, your sensitive personal data, into the chat. Obviously, it's a public forum. The live chat will disappear at the end of the event, but I am going to keep copy and paste it just in case we can refer to quotes and stuff later on. But we're obviously again not going to use personal data in that. So I am incredibly happy and also very nervous about tonight. It is difficult to kind of get a combination of people all together in one place in this world, but I'm so happy just to have these panelists with us tonight. You've seen, or you will have access to, the full bios for everyone in the Eventbrite or on the Facebook page, and we're going to stick it up onto the YouTube video once we're done, once it becomes a proper video. So you will be able to watch this again on our channel. But if I just go through just to kind of give you a brief intro for everyone, Professor Luke Clements you might recognise him, or you might know his name from the big, fat, heavy adult social care textbook that is probably my biggest and heaviest book that I own. But luckily, he writes a really, really accessible book, which is what we're going to kind of springboard off tonight, Clustered Injustice. It's only about 100 pages in terms of the actual kind of body of the text. If you are befuddled and confused and frustrated by the health and social care and homelessness sectors, then I cannot recommend reading it enough. It's so beautifully articulated, and it helps you get your thoughts and confusion into some kind of coherent way. I told Will Flack about it, who does the live stream with us, and he said it was like listening to the Beatles for the first time. I don't like the Beatles myself, but I know what he means. It really did help, and kind of really helped me, not only kind of help sort of understand why the problems happen, but he also gives some really positive and optimistic solutions to those problems, and some really kind of concrete ways that could be things could improve. So thanks so much for being with us tonight, Luke. And then we've got Sarah. So you might recognize Sarah from our YouTube channel. She's popped up on a few videos before. She's been incredibly generous with her time over the years for me personally, because when I've gone into a council, I've armed with the Homelessness Code of Guidance, and I'm reading what it says in the Code of Guidance, and I get told, no, that's not the law. You know, that's not what it says. That's not what we do here. Sarah's been able just to at key times just say, no, it's okay, Mike. You know, you're not totally wrong here. That is what the law says. It's just councils aren't following it in that case. So Sarah co-authored a book called Defending Possession Proceedings under Legal Action Group, and she is a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers. If you haven't subscribed to Doughty Street's YouTube channel, then why haven't you? Because it's a beautiful resource. It's free, loads of really good information there. Shannon will be furiously copying links into the chat right now, hopefully. So for those who are following what I'm saying, Shannon's going to be just putting some links in there that helps you navigate to those different resources. So thanks very much for being here tonight, Sarah. And again, it's really appreciated. Next up, we've got Giles. Giles, you may well know, if you worked in the sector for any length of time, you will probably have come across his blog, Nearly Legal. When I worked in Bedford Borough Council 10 years ago, and I was overwhelmed by this lack of knowledge of homelessness law, I started Googling. I found Giles's blog, and that has been with me ever since. I told a good friend of mine called Ross that he was on the panel tonight, and he was like, you don't know how many people I've got housed because of the information in that blog. So Giles is also a practicing solicitor with Anthony Gold, and he also co-authored a book. I'm just making sure I don't confuse these. So Housing Conditions, Tenants' Rights. But yeah, again, Nearly Legal. If you go on that website, the different cases are really well organized into the archive. So there's a section specifically about homelessness. It's just a really good way to get around complicated ideas and principles within the law. And you often get an email every Monday morning at 2 a.m. With the latest stuff. So thanks for that, Giles. It's really, really helpful. Next up, we've got Marnie Burden. So Marnie wears many hats. And I guess tonight she's with her hat as being a former local authority housing manager and commissioner for 18 years up in the north. She's also a trustee for Expert Link. If you haven't been on Expert Link's training into co-production and you think you're going to end homelessness, then you need to think again. You need to go on that training. It's incredible. Again, Shannon's going to put a link to it in the chat. But for me and for a lot of other people, unless we can truly listen to people who've been homeless and have been through this system, we're going to keep doing the same old stuff and not succeeding. So thanks again, Marnie, for being here tonight. And where are we up to? Shannon. Shannon's my colleague, co-founder of HBP. Shannon also wears lots of hats. So one of the hats is involved with inputting into kind of policy stuff. So she sits on Expert Links, DWP and DLUC panels. She's fed into stuff. I'm not quite sure what I can say she's done, so I'm going to not say too much in case I get in trouble for disclosing stuff that she's working on right now. So that's one of the things she does. She also has a hobby of FOIing and asking lots of questions to housing committees around the country. She has nearly got responses from every local authority in the country about council's use of Now Medical and Housing Reviews Limited around vulnerability and kind of how that kind of all the numbers add up. So when she's completed that, and there's a few awkward ones, we will surely probably be saying more about that. And Shannon also delivers training for HBP with me around the country. So yesterday we're down in Woking, struggling with the M1 being closed on the way back. So we haven't slept brilliantly. And then myself, I also wear various hats, but I guess I'm here tonight as a former local authority worker and whistleblower. So 10 years ago, I worked for Bedford Borough Council. I saw lots of outrageous stuff happening. And ever since then, I've kind of just had this question of why does it happen? Why is this open secret of gatekeeping happening? It's not as simple as, oh, these housing officers are bad people, because most of them are not. Most of them go into the job because they want to help, but this bureaucratic system kind of chews them up and puts them in a position where they are pressured into breaking the law. So I guess what I'm hoping tonight is that we can, as sensitively and delicately as possible, explore this issue. We understand there's a lot riding on it. We appreciate, genuinely, I sympathise with housing officers with the kind of the poison chalice they've got. But for me, the question is, what does it take to stop it happening? Because personally, I think if you end gatekeeping, then you actually leads to ending homelessness, because you then get more houses built and all the rest of it. So that's the intros. If I'm sure of nothing else tonight, we're going to overrun. So I'm going to try and clumsily time keep my way through it. So we're going to start the actual proper event bit now. And we're going to start by looking at the definition of gatekeeping, because as many of us who work in the sector, we're institutionalized, we don't realize it. We use this jargon, and actually a lot of people won't know what gatekeeping is. When I worked in a charity, homelessness charity for 6 years, never heard of it, never heard of homelessness law at all. And so I think it makes sense for us to start at that point. So Sarah, can I start with you? I'm hoping this develops into a nice informal chat so people can come in and out and stuff. But if we start with you, Sarah, are you able just to, so your audio is still not working. It's right, we can work on it. If you go to your bottom left, down at the mute button, you've got a little up arrow, and you should be able to select from your microphones. So, and basically select one that looks relevant. But if not, so whilst we're waiting, Giles, oh yeah, there we go. I heard you. Say something again. Yeah, there we go. Cool. Go for it, Sarah.
Right. So, what is gatekeeping? Well, the first thing to say is it's not a technical word, it's not a legal word, it's not something that you can go to the court and say, well, I've been gate kept. It's not something you can get an order about or compensation for, although probably if you went to the Ombudsman, they'd know exactly what you're talking about. But we know it when we see it. And we understand it to be broadly the process by which local authorities seek to avoid having to carry out the duties that they have in relation to people who are or may be homeless. That's basically what it's about. They do this in a number of ways. They do this by just not accepting applications. Sometimes this is through making some sort of decision, but often it's just about leaving people in the waiting room so long that eventually they get fed up and walk out, and they don't have any record that this person has ever been there. They spend so long in the waiting room, and eventually somebody says, "Oh, why don't you go to CAB instead, or why don't you go here instead," or something of that nature. They do this by diverting people elsewhere. So this is a more sort of formal way of gatekeeping. Birmingham was quite guilty of this. They somehow make some sort of arrangements with another organisation or another perhaps a landlord organisation or a charitable organisation or something like that. But they find a way of sort of fobbing this person off. Another way that local authorities gatekeep is that they make rush decisions. So they made a decision that day that this person is not in priority need, for example. It's off their books. They've made a decision. They haven't really investigated it properly, but that's one way of gatekeeping. And another is referring applicants to other local authority areas. Now, of course, they are allowed to do that, but only in the proper way, and only once they've taken the application, considered it, made decisions, and properly dealt with it. So the starting point, really, and I don't want to go on about this too long, but the starting point is that Part 7 of the Housing Act 1996 is there for people who are, it's an emergency protection system. It's a safety net. It's there for people when they really need it, for people who might otherwise be on the streets or be in accommodation which is so poor that they're not reasonably expected to continue living there. So it's really serious and really important that local authorities treat it with the seriousness that it deserves. And because it's this safety net, because it's designed to be there the moment that you need it, the process for making an application, or the process for sort of putting yourself within the Part 7 framework, is really quite relaxed. It's a really low threshold to go to meet. So you've got Section 179, that's the first provision, that says that basically there must be advice and assistance and information which is provided to everybody in the area. So that's the starting point. Every person that's in the local authority area should be able to access advice and information. Now, one of the things that local authorities should be providing advice and information about is the ability to make a homeless application. So you're sort of falling at the very first hurdle if you're not telling people who may well be homeless that they can make a homeless application, that there's assistance available for them, and that actually they, the local authority, are the primary body which is charged with providing that assistance. That's the first point. Then making an application itself, well, the Code of Guidance, and there's plenty of case law on it as well, makes really clear that it doesn't need to be in any particular form. It doesn't need to be a letter. You don't need to have a solicitor. All you really need to do is to say, I need help, or I want you to help. That's really all it amounts to. It doesn't even need to be to any particular department. You don't even need to go to the homeless persons unit. The Code of Guidance makes that really clear. There was a case in which there ended up being a whole debate about whether or not you could go to a leisure centre or approach a grave digger or any other council employees. The case didn't bother to look into all those sort of rather extreme examples. But the point is that really going to the local authority and saying, I need help and I'm homeless, that's enough. That should absolutely be enough. And once you get over that threshold of saying, I want help, well, it's quite obvious from that point that a local authority has got reason to believe you may be homeless, because you're telling them that you're homeless. Or you're telling them, I've got water running down my walls, the ceiling just collapsed, I've got mold all over my floor and my children are coughing. Actually, that as well is reason to believe that it might be accommodation which is not reasonable for someone to continue to occupy, and that therefore that person is homeless. So any of those sort of sets of facts are going to engage the local authority's duty to investigate what is by that point already a homeless application. So they've got a homeless application because you've asked for help. They've got reason to believe that you may be homeless because you've told them about the mold on the walls, or you've told them that you're about to get evicted, whatever it is. And so Section 184 of the Housing Act kicks in, and then that says, well, at that point, then a local authority needs to make inquiries. Needs to make inquiries as to whether or not they owe a duty to you. And the first and most obvious duty that they might owe is the duty to provide interim accommodation. So if you may be homeless and you may be in priority need, then accommodation should be being provided to you on an interim basis. It's not going to be the best accommodation. It's going to be emergency accommodation, which is provided short term, but they should be putting a roof over your head. Because if it may be that you're vulnerable, if it may be that you're in priority need for some other reason, then really the local authority should be providing accommodation, asking questions later, investigating it later. It's a low, everyone knows it's a really low threshold, but it doesn't always work out that way, and that's what gatekeeping is.
Yeah, no. So there's a couple of things I just wanted to bounce off of that. So that's incredibly helpful, and it's interesting. It's not a legal term, but it's as you say, it's something the LGO, the local government ombudsman, would fully understand. We're seeing like an increase in people, for example, who might be experiencing domestic abuse. They go on the council's website because they don't know what else to do, and the council's website says fill in this form. So they fill in the form. It's a Part 6 form rather than Part 7. But in the course of it, they say I'm experiencing domestic abuse, and yet the council's not picking up on it. Their IT system itself is not geared up to, highlighting that and getting a human being looking at that application. So that's something we're seeing a lot of, and we're also seeing things like, people going to refuges. There is some kind of system in place between the refuge and the local authority to do some sort of housing application, but then they end up bed blocking because the council doesn't pick it up. And actually, in my understanding, that would be a Part 7 application as well, because they're in a refuge. There's reasons to believe they might be homeless. They've asked for help, therefore it's triggered. So there, as I say, there are things that potentially housing officers might not even know are happening. They might not realise their system is just not fit for purpose in that sense. But yeah, does anyone want to add anything into that? Because I think, as I say, it's kind of a deceptively broad, kind of definition. Giles?
I'm not sure it's them not realizing that the system's not fit for purpose. Certainly for websites and forms to fill in, this is deliberate. You will not find contact details for the homeless unit on the website, or it will be hidden away. And if you do, there will be a form to fill in, which will send you everywhere else first before actually allowing for an application. And there's been judicial reviews on this, both of which were successful and actually incredibly well run, because they managed to get a group of people together to bring the claim. But I mean, just actually hiding access is I suppose the starting point of gatekeeping. It's just, how do you make an application to the council? They're not going to tell you. Full stop.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly Shannon had some luck with Bedford. She raised one of these issues with, in the housing committee, so in public, because I think that's the best way to do this sort of stuff. And they okay, we'll change the system. So there's, as you say, and there's other things that those forms don't really pick up on. So things like disabilities, they won't ask you if you have a disability and you need help filling in the form. So as you say again, Giles, I guess it's another situation where the throughput or the process that should take someone through to actually seeing a human being and getting housed doesn't really function.
Well, I think, I mean,
here. Oh, sorry, go on, Giles.
No, I was going to say, as Sarah said earlier, there is no prescribed. The council can't say this is the only way you can apply.
And on that note, so this is maybe going a bit off piece. So the duty to refer process, which are, certain organisations are under duty to do, so probation and prisons and so on, they have to do this duty to refer form. But first thing, that doesn't trigger a homeless application. It will often say on the form. But what's happening also we see is where you go to a council, you ring up a council, we've got a client, this is the situation. They say, oh, you need to fill in a duty to refer form. And one sense, you just got to say, no, we don't. We're just going to send it via email, because often those duty to refer forms don't ask for the necessary information to assess things like, are they in priority need? I'm going to put you guys on the spot a little bit. It's a bit awkward, but I'm sure you're going to be okay with it. I wondered for this evening whether we could extend our definition of gatekeeping a little bit to include perverse decision making. So things like where someone is very obviously vulnerable and they get this nonsense template, section 184 decision saying that they're not vulnerable, equally that they are intentionally homeless when it's clear they're not, or even that they're not homeless. So not just those kind of failures to follow the process, but that kind of that effect where people effectively still denied housing, and it's obviously outside the bandwidth of a reasonable decision. Are we okay doing that? And I know for me, it's kind of a similar sort of thing.
I think that feeds into the point I was making about making rushed decisions. I think they're parts of the same thing, aren't they? Either making decisions very, very quickly, but also making decisions that they must know full well can't stand up. And yet it buys them some time, because they make a decision, they know it's wrong, but you've got to then request a review. And that's going to take a while, and probably they don't even carry it out in 8 weeks or however long they've got for it. They probably still ask for longer, and probably you're backed against the wall, and you have to agree to longer. It's part of the same thing. I mean, to give you perhaps one of the worst examples that I've had, I had a case where a 19, what was she 20. She was 20, I think, when she made the application, and the local authority said she couldn't make an application because she was a child, as in she was the child of her mother. So there we go. I mean, it's a ludicrous decision, but it bought them some time.
And I mean, there was a case which I read about it somewhere. I can't remember where it was, where a young person went into a council reporting that they were being abused by their parents, and the council said, we need to have a letter from your parents just confirming that you're being abused. I can't remember where it was, but that I'm not imagining that. And I'm going to be quite clumsy with timekeeping tonight, guys. So I'm sorry that it's going to be a bit grating, but I want to say a couple more things on this. One is that the verification of rough sleeping processes, which are pushed often by big charities, which I find quite frustrating, if they're done in a certain way, will be unlawful. So if you've got a local authority street outreach worker telling someone who's rough sleeping, oh, you need to go and rough sleep and we'll come and find you the next night before we're going to help you, that would also be something which is clearly gatekeeping, because we're not talking about vulnerability tonight, but most people rough sleeping for any length of time will be vulnerable and therefore in priority need. And there'll be certainly reasons to believe that they might be to trigger those initial duties to provide interim accommodation. So that's a problem that we're seeing, that a lot of street outreach workers won't realise is an issue. A lot of, they just won't realise that actually they have a duty, if they're a local authority officer, to actually do something. And certain local authorities will cynically put a voluntary sector organisation between them and the rough sleeper so that it's not technically them doing it. I have a couple of questions that, given we've got this group of people together, we can't not ask, and some of them could be quite straightforward answers. So my first question is, if you've got a housing officer knowingly or recklessly denying someone housing to someone unlawfully using this strategy of gatekeeping, could it be a criminal offence? So, I don't know whether it would be or not, but certainly there's kind of offences like misconduct in a public office or misfeasance in a public office. Is there any sort of, is there any sort of penalty for a housing options officer deliberately and unlawfully denying someone housing? Has anyone got any kind of case law up their sleeve about that, or any sort of particular understanding of the law on that?
I could possibly say there was criminal offence. That's absolutely not my area, but I would very much doubt it. What you can't do is claim damages. You can't claim damages for a breach of housing law. That said, there will be circumstances in which it might amount to discrimination, and I have had successful discrimination challenges come out of a failure to provide someone with suitable accommodation. But it does need to be quite particular facts to put it into that framework.
So I guess my next question, then, following on from that, so if it's not a criminal offence, what penalties are there to discourage councils from doing this? What is there anything out there which really is going to incentivize lawful work? Is that, I mean, I know we're going to probably return to this issue later in the event, but is why not break the law, get caught, and then keep doing it? What's the incentive for councils not to do that?
Well,
Giles?
depressing answer is they might have to pay judicial review costs, or they might get a penalty from the ombudsman, and that's it.
Okay, so that's kind of what I thought in that sense on that one. And again, I think we're going to return to that question later on. My next question is kind of related, just whilst we're on this topic, and this is probably to you, Luke, because I've asked lots of people this question before and no one had a clear answer for me, but if anyone knows, I think you will. Again, if you've got a housing officer who knowingly denies housing to someone unlawfully, and let's say for sake of argument that person clearly has care and support needs, would it ever be the case that would become a safeguarding issue in terms of, would it be institutional abuse? I think the answer is no, but I just want to hear it from an expert. And if it's not institutional abuse, would it be any other form of abuse that kind of might kind of mean that we would potentially raise a safeguarding alert, for example, if we were working with someone who'd just been gatekept? So hopefully that question makes sense. It was a bit of a rambling one, but
I think it would be abuse, institutional abuse. The ombudsman's used that phrase not recently against local authorities for failing to provide support, and that could, of course, be housing. Yeah, I think the definition within, if you're looking at the Care Act, of abuse is very wide now. So yeah, you could argue that. It'd be an interesting point. I've never heard it done, but yeah, I think so.
So I've done it once when a housing officer was just off the scale, not doing their job properly, and it resulted in the person getting housed, but we never got a clear answer from the safeguarding team. But it's good to know that it's not off the wall to kind of take that approach with a, as I say, particularly unhelpful housing officer, I guess, who's just digging the heels and then just refusing to help.
Just picking up on Giles's point. I mean, I think that sort of callous, indifferent responses is pretty well risk-free in terms of damages, but it's not risk-free in terms of your professional standing, or if somebody does say, well, that's institutional abuse, because the local authority's got to investigate that, and that's going to make a real mess. So in terms of your individual career or individual officers, there are risks which are sort of not justiciable, but they are amenable. In terms of the local authority, of course, they'll just say, just one bad apple, or the person was under stress or something like that. Yeah. But
Yeah,
I would think
okay.
raising safeguarding is quite a cute idea.
I mean, I think we haven't got time to look at the ins and outs of it, but certainly I think if nothing else today, we can just put ideas out there for people to go and think on. And I think certainly that's something that's reassuring for me. As I say, first of all, tonight it wasn't ridiculous to do it, but secondly, that actually I might have actually had a point. So I think the majority of housing officers are trying to do their best. You do come across a few who I certainly have come across a few people who seem to, well, they boast about gatekeeping. So I'm kind of coloured, I'm kind of my views on housing officers are tainted by those officers who work like that. Okay, hopefully that's kind of introduced our idea of gatekeeping and kind of what we're talking about tonight. Luke, I just wanted to spend a good few minutes just talking about really kind of some topics that you cover in your book, which essentially, I listened to your podcast twice today because I thought I need to kind of get all this in my head at once, and there's so much in there, I just couldn't do it. There's just so many different ideas and different strands to it. It's just a lot of stuff that I could return to. But my first question is really, why do you talk about these kind of failures as an issue of injustice? And that might seem weird because if you listen to the homelessness sector, listen to the charity sector, a lot of the language is around these are acts of mercy. These people have messed up and we need to be nice to them and give them a second chance. And I don't think that's on the mark really. But I guess my question is why would you say, or why is it an issue of injustice rather than anything else really?
Well, I think it's about social justice. What I talk in the book about is disadvantage, and I define disadvantage in terms of let me just read it really. People who experience disadvantage, if they have a level of support which the state, level of support from the state, support that a responsive state would and should provide, and the state fails to meet that need. So in terms of social justice, people have needs for basic health, housing, education, employment needs. Those are issues of social justice is states have signed up to internationally. Then people have an expectation the state will do that. And when the state fails to do that, then that's a matter of injustice. So that sort of widens it it's sort of very much in what's called vulnerability theory about this is what responsive states should do. And most people would agree that that's what responsive states should do. And they fail to do it. Okay.
So that leads us on to the question of why they do it. Now, you talk in the book about managerialism, you talk about bureaucracies, you talk about, even kind of honest triers who enter into the profession wanting to do good, just end up kind of being forced into stat gaming and cheating the stats and all that kind of thing. And you also talk about failure demand. I probably introduced too many things there all at once, but yeah, what's kind of, again, how does that managerialism act within these kind of bureaucracies? What does it do to a well-meaning housing officer to be under that kind of management style? Or you froze. It's either me freezing, Luke, or it's you. Is it me? No, it's Luke. Luke, so you're frozen right now. That's Zoom for us. We'll figure out when you're coming back in. Sorry, there you're back in. Sorry, you just froze then. So yeah, we didn't hear any of that. It froze as you started to speak.
Sorry, yeah. Well, if I was to sort of try and sum up what Sarah's just said, I think gatekeeping is managing demand. And Parliament creates all of these obligations, and the government and local government then frustrate that by managing demand, by adopting all sorts of issues. And in the book, I really look at, there's a guy called John Seddon who writes about systems thinking, and he says that managing demand is incredibly inefficient, but managing quality is very efficient. But when you have effectively managerial, which is top down, you give no discretion at all to the front face. You just have very, very detailed rule books. about this is what you do and this is the form you refer to and this is how you, and then you get cultures developing about, oh, this is a good way of buying a bit of time or sending, managing demand. So that's about controlling budgets. And that's all managerialism is about. It's about quantity. And you either stay within those systems, and I talk about what it does to individuals working within those systems. Most of them have got mortgages and they get sucked into this, and they develop what I call learned helplessness, that they just do the job and they just follow the rule book. And so the only way to break out of that system is to, in my view, give much more discretion. I know that's a dangerous thing to the coalface, for people to be imaginative and work across and in a way not co-produce, but work with, listen to people and work with other agencies, because systems thinking is very much about silos, about the silo of housing, the silo of social care, the silo of the NHS, the silo of the DWP, and learning all the trauma that is generated from having to work with these different systems completely in isolation. So that the solution effectively is not to get rid of silos, because Weber would tell us that bureaucracy is inevitable. You'll never get rid of it. It's to have generalist workers who can work across these systems. And that, again, is the state taking responsibility for that trauma that the silos create. And so, yeah, the solution in the book is in praise of generalists, basically.
And what, because I think you quote a stat, I think it's every pound a local authority spends on disability grants, it saves £10 elsewhere in the own council's budget. But so who is it? Is it council chief execs that need to be the ones that kind of be brave and make those decisions, or whereabouts in the hierarchy are those structures reinforced?
We did some research on disabled facilities grants, which you're quoting, and we showed that if social services paid £70,000 for a disabled facilities grant for a challenging kid with autism, they tended to save the authority £350,000, and these are old figures. It'd be much more now. And it's a really interesting. I work with the local authorities, and everybody within the authority accepts that. Housing officers say it's a no-brainer. I've talked to the chief executive. I've had the director of systems change within a really good authority and social care. Everybody agrees with it. And that was 5 years ago. And nothing's changed. And I sort of quote from The Grapes of Wrath, where you were sort of evicting people from Dust Bowl houses, and the banks, everybody in the bank didn't want that person to be evicted, but they were evicted because the system does it. So I think it's incredibly difficult to get top-down change, to get a chief executive to say social services should wire money to the housing budget. But if you give more discretion at the local level, and you employ a few more anarchists, at the front level, you can work around these things, and people do amazing things. But trying to have systems change at that top level is, I've spent a lot of time and not achieved anything.
Marnie, does that resonate with your experience of
yeah, quite a lot. I just remember when we did the MAME initiative, the Making Every Adult Matter. So that's working with a small group of people who have got multiple and complex needs. And it usually is, sort of in our area, it was like the 10 top rough sleepers. Getting everybody together was really good, getting social workers, probation officers together, drug and alcohol services around the table, and the police were actually brilliant, surprisingly. But yeah, so we all got together, did some really good work. Then we went to the Adult Safeguarding Board, where all the big wigs are there and everything. You show them your charts and do the cost benefit analysis, show them how much you can save on somebody, and then go, come on. And then everybody's just like, yeah, they love the presentation and everything, you know, talking to people who've been through the services and things. When it actually came down to it, it's like nobody wants to know. It's not their problem, you know. It's not the NHS, it's not mental health, it's not, you know, drug and alcohol. It's, yeah, it does need that systems change, and that's what it was all about originally. But sometimes it's about those personalities as well. You've got to have somebody really high up to drive that change. So it was just so frustrating. And when I left the council, it didn't carry on. I'm not saying that I was the one who drove it, but, you know, I was just like a cog in a wheel. You know, some good people did leave, but it's very difficult. It needs to come from the top, but yeah.
So, I mean, I'm just going to mention this very briefly. Like, again, for me, everyone has got a role to play in ending gatekeeping and ending homelessness.
Agree. Yes.
One of the things anyone can do is go to their local housing committee and ask awkward questions. Like, you'll be amazed what you can do. And that use of the word anarchist, Luke, is an interesting one. But yeah, I'm not going to argue with you. Luke, I've got one more question about the book for now. You have this term in it called warrior parents. What's that about? Because it was very, very interesting, and it made me think of several people I've worked with. I was like, yeah, wow, that just nails how they operated.
Yeah, it's a lot about that. It's about what the system does to people. So I'm really mostly working in social care, and there's all this really amazing stuff at the moment going on about trauma-informed social care and things like this, trauma-informed this. And this is the idea that you've got to treat people, you've got to realize that they may come from abuse or abusive childhood or abusive relationships or sort of substance misuse, and you've got to accept they're traumatized. But what they don't realize is that most of the people I deal with are traumatized, not, you know, they are traumatized by childhood abuse and sort of terrible things during their lives. But the major trauma they experience is from these systems that require them to sort of have a different complaint here, a different complaint there. They've got to learn this, they've got to learn that, and they've got the wrong form, so they've got to go back to square one. And they're juggling, I call it clusters of problems. They're juggling 5 different problems at any one time. And then a lawyer might solve one, or a barrister, but then another one will come along immediately. So they don't live normal lives. And they have what Kahneman talks about as very little cognitive space. They can't think slowly. So they react very quickly if something is said. And say things that might be quite abusive. And then, of course, they're labeled difficult, problem. There's a behavioral policy, I know this, that, and the other. And then they're excluded because of their behavior that the system has created. I mean, I spent about 40 years as a solicitor a short while ago, and all the time, every time I was dealing with the authorities, they'd say, you know, your client's very difficult. She's a very difficult person. And I'd say, yes, she is. She is incredibly difficult. She's complained to the Law Society about me, but she wasn't born that way. You know, she wasn't born that way at all until she had a disabled child. And you've created that. And you've got to take responsibility for that, actually. But of course, the ombudsman, the courts, everybody has, oh, well, you know, their behavior was unacceptable, therefore we won't listen to them. And it must be very difficult for frontline people with that, but they've got to have that insight that this is actually systems created trauma.
So there's so much stuff which just hits nail on the head. I think I want to come back to, but Shannon, just saw you on mute then. Do you want to come in? No? Okay, cool, that's cool.
Yeah, no, I will. I think because it's really interesting how the clients always get labelled difficult, but actually 9 times out of 10, you know, those parents that you're talking about, they're not after, you know, cherry on the cake. They're after just the cake, just what they're actually entitled to. And I think it's really interesting when, you know, those people, and we've just had a comment in the YouTube channel where someone was a housing officer and they had 294 cases. But then when you frame it as, that's an extreme caseload, that shouldn't happen. That you're setting the housing officers up to fail then, but they still don't have that cluster of problems. And that sounds like I'm being quite black and white about it, but that housing officer still doesn't have that cluster of different issues and different systems that they have to fight through. They can roll it up one way. And I just think it's an interesting way to perhaps reframe that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about disabled children, I mean, I remember one family, and I think it was in a month, they had 300 different appointments with professionals. They've got a caseload of 300 different people who are all taking notes, who are all doing exactly the same thing and reassessing them. And they've all got different procedures and different silos. That's quite a caseload. I mean, obviously 300 is absurd, and the system is traumatizing that worker. Yeah.
Just that, I mean, because trauma-informed stuff is obviously a big buzzword in the homelessness sector.
Yeah.
But there's a real kind of omission or deafening silence around, exactly as you say. I'm so happy you said that, Luke. So the trauma that's caused by the system, because when I work with Just Us, when I work for Just Us, we'd often do exit interviews with people who've been housed, and they would say the worst thing about being homeless was how I was treated. There's one guy who was homeless, now working at a senior level in a charity, works very closely with housing officers, and he what he said was, it was 10 years ago. Some of those housing officers are the same. I remember them. They don't remember me. They see hundreds of people, but I remember them, and I remember their tone. I remember their body language, and I remember how they just said no, just off you go. And I think that's something that, as the homelessness sector, there's lots of good stuff on trauma-informed stuff about childhood trauma, but there's no acknowledgement. And this is something he actually went on to say. There's no acknowledgement that it is us that's causing a lot of these traumas, and we need, and exactly as you say, we need to take responsibility for it and stop doing it and do something else. So yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, and with the warrior parents, I was really interested by the fact that you give some examples of parents who had fought successfully against councils. It had taken everything from them in terms of time and energy, but they'd won. And that's interesting to me because it gives me hope that as lay people we could all do that. Presumably the thing they had wasn't their knowledge of law, which they presumably started off with none, but it was the fact they just kept going and they didn't give up, and they kept complaining, they kept challenging, and so on.
It's like your panel. There's some great people there. Eventually you will bash their doors down and get. There are great resources there, but it's a struggle.
Yeah. Okay, so as predicted, we're slightly behind schedule, not as much as I was fearing to be, so it's all good. We're going to move on to our next kind of mini section, which is really just, I guess, you've already started us off very nicely for it, but just asking the question, okay, so good people go into the homelessness sector as housing officers to do good, and yet they find themselves telling people that there's nothing they can do for them, telling people to go to the night shelter that night because there's nothing else available for them, telling people that if they don't accept this accommodation, their children will be removed from their care. All these kind of things, which would probably, most people would see that as being something that's well outside what's reasonable behaviour. So building on kind of in fact, I'll come back to you, Luke, if that's okay. So you use the example of a game of Scrabble in the book. So you kind of say, well, one of the problems is that housing officers don't get trained on what the law actually is. So do you want to explain that analogy of the game of Scrabble?
Yeah, I mean, the book's got various chapters and each one is a game. So the name of the book is The Game of Bowls, how it appears to be fair and on a level green, but the bowl is weighted. And I use that analogy for the law. That judges have level playing fields, they're very fair, but the law is weighted against the interests of disadvantaged people. It's loaded. In Scrabble, I mean, one of the reasons housing officers and social care and health professionals and things give terrible decisions is because they have no idea what the rules of the game are. They aren't, the one thing you can guarantee is they're not taught the law. They're taught the local rule. And Scrabble, I mean, there's been research on it, but every family plays Scrabble slightly differently, because the way you learn Scrabble, when somebody first says to you, do you want to play Scrabble, Mike, you'll say, well, I don't know really. How do you play? I'd love to play. And they say, well, don't worry, we'll show you how it's played. And so what you do, the research shows, is that they have just different ways of starting and finishing and adding up, and what you do with the blank tile, and that's exactly what happens in most areas of social welfare law, is that they get the job in social care or housing, and you say, well, this is really interesting, but I'm not really sure about what the law is on homelessness or adult assessment. And they say, well, don't worry, we'll show you how it happens in Hereford, which is where I live, or in Bolton or wherever. And so you have these local rules, and the officers actually genuinely often believe that that's what the rules are of the game. They have their own local Scrabble rules. And it's only when, Giles or Sarah come along that that they are told to look at the rules, the act, and they realize that they've been playing the game wrong for a long time. And it's very much in the interest of the senior managers to maintain that ignorance.
So one thing that, again, just as an example of how you can use local democracy to sort things out. So we did an FOI in Bedford, what's the housing team's training schedule? This is going back in 2019, I think. And the answer was, there isn't one. And we actually don't know what training the staff team have actually had. We were able to take that to the housing committee and say, how about it? Following that, they had good training about domestic abuse from shelter. Doughty Street, Sarah delivered training around the Equality Act. And then now we're told, on a recruitment drive, and they're going to have it's, kind of a formal process. Now, again, it's just an example of as you say, look, they're kind of put in front of these very complicated laws and expected to know something without actually being told what the law is. So I think, again, for people out there who've got a local council that could do better, it's another great avenue of kind of just exploring their training schedule and just making sure they've got those key areas covered, data protection and kind of, social care and stuff like that. I mean, I noticed that there was a recent case with the LGO, which I think it was Westminster Council, and they got called up for the fact the housing officer hadn't picked up that there was a need to carry out a Section 9 assessment under the Care Act because there was a parent care and support need. So yeah, it's crazy that we expect lay people who may have no qualifications whatsoever relevant to the sector thrown in, and as you say, look, just kind of told the wrong way of doing things. I mean, I would say with that, I can only think of one housing officer ever who I went in and said, do you know what, actually that's not what the law is, the law's this, and they actually listen to me. What tends to happen is they kind of dig in, and it can get quite adversarial, but I wouldn't say I was to blame there. I was saying, this is what the law is, and they would kind of paint themselves into a corner, and then until it was overturned at review or something. So yeah.
Can I just, I mean, it can depend on, management as well. I mean, Shelter would come in regularly to do training in the Northeast, like across all the Northeast councils as well. But that's when you've got good managers who want their staff to know the law and give them the autonomy to make those decisions. And I mean, I have met other managers who micromanage, don't allow their caseworkers to make any decisions at all. Everything has to come to them to be signed off, so it's but yeah, for a good caseworker to have good training as well. But then again, it's like the resources, isn't it, to be able to place people where they need to be as well. But yeah, it's training's very, very important, and I can't understand how any housing officers don't have any training around that. That's shocking.
Yeah, I don't think it's that unusual, just looking at a few of the figures we've seen. So I think a lot of councils, as I say, if you live in a certain council, just put those FOIs in. Sarah, have you unmuted there?
Sorry, I just wanted to add that I think this sort of misinformation about the law is really horribly deliberate and sometimes incredibly serious. And I wanted to pick up on the example that you gave of families being threatened for having their children taken care, because I have seen that far too many times, and they ought to know that there is absolutely no way that could be lawful. Absolutely no way. And yet it happens all the time. Now, it must be happening because someone has decided that that's what they're going to tell them. And it makes me absolutely furious. And I just wanted to be really clear, because you mentioned it, that anyone listening, no, local authorities cannot do that. You take a child into care where you've got reason to think that where there's a significant risk of harm and it's attributable to the care that families are providing, the parents are providing. You can't do it because you only want to accommodate the child.
So my most recent LGO case that was upheld, I was involved in. That's exactly what happened, and the individual complained about it. We made contemporaneous notes and complained, and the LGO upheld that case. And it was encouraging for me because, generally speaking, with the LGO, they're kind of restricted to just finding stuff based on what's written in the records. But in this case, they said, yeah, on the balance of probabilities, that's what was said, and she was given compensation. Giles, did I see you unmute there?
Yeah, I was just following up on Sarah's point. I mean, this often is. It's not just a sort of ingrown practice. It is policy driven. It is effect management run. But it's really hard to establish. I can think of only really a couple of judicial reviews, one a Midlands council, one a London council, where they've actually managed to establish that this was not just a one-off errant decision, but actually a driven policy for the team. And driven by management, so it's really hard to challenge. But yeah, I mean, you see these decisions again and again, and the threat to take children into care is one of the most abhorrent ones, I think. But it's this is not happening by accident or simply by habit. This is deliberate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's time for me to talk about particularly tonight, but as I say, a whistle blew in Bedford Borough Council. But for me, although I'd say majority of housing officers were decent, they wanted to do good, the prevailing culture in that team was pretty disgusting, and it was only driven by maybe a couple of individuals, senior individuals, who would instruct their staff to get rid of them, using whatever test you can, whether it's local connection or whatever. But there aren't a lot of options. I know technically there are options if you're if you're a housing officer in that position, but there aren't really a lot of options. You will be putting your job at risk. The most outrageous case I ever saw in Bedford, she received very large amounts of compensation for a number of failures, but there were 10 housing officers who gatekept her in the course of 4 months, and the only one that tried to get her housed lost their contract a couple of weeks later, and there was an inference that it was because they'd argued with the managers. So that's the reality that housing officers find themselves in. Personally, I think whistleblowing is an option. It may not be the most effective one, but there are scant other options. You will be looking at a career change probably. But yeah, I guess it's probably obvious what my views are about what we need to do to actually end the issue. Okay, so one thing I will mention before we move on. So in preparing for the event, I talked to a number of housing officers, and it was very clear for the housing officers who responded that they were burnt out. They were done. They were not looked after. I don't quite know why they were still doing the job. I think the reason they do the job is they know if they leave, then it gets worse for their clients. So they're in this kind of predicament where they know that if they're doing the best job they possibly can do, if they leave that role, the person who replaces them, if there is anyone at all replacing them, will likely do a worse job. So I think, as it says, I think it's not difficult to sympathise with people in that role. I think my viewpoint's clear that it's more sympathy owed to the homeless person who's on the other end of that gatekeeping. But that's I guess while we're kind of exploring this. Okay, so and just to go back to something Luke said about that learned helplessness. So you've got staff who are not able to make their own decisions. They've got to run everything through a boss, and they kind of get into that state. I might even be able to share that quote, Luke, because I think it's just a really good one if I can get the right one. This is again at page 79 if you're interested from the book. So over controlling highly stressed and coercive management regimes disempower frontline workers, producing a form of learned helplessness, which Klein describes as a passive mindset of just following the steps and not really thinking about what they're doing. And to criticize housing officers, I guess, as well, there was that kind of they had compartmentalized it, and I don't think they could see the problems that they had and the difficulties they had, but I don't think they were necessarily connecting with the impact it was having on the people that they were unlawfully denying housing. And I guess that's because it's too, it's overwhelming. But that's something which I kind of noticed in the feedback that I got. So, okay, we're back on track. What harm does it do? Now, me and Shannon, in preparing for this event, we knew we were going to struggle to do it justice. As I've said already, it's amazing how many people report that the worst thing about being homeless was walking into that local authority, turning up there, just getting treated abruptly, treated rudely, and then off and sent elsewhere. And in our last event, David Ford, the chief executive of Expert Link, talked about just how that was actually one of the lowest points of his whole life. So I think we're going to ask the question now. What harm does it do? First of all, let's just talk about the individual harms, and then we'll maybe be able to talk about the kind of wider harms that gatekeeping does. So I don't know, Shannon, if you, it's very difficult to articulate it and do any justice to it, but do you want to kind of help us start off?
Yeah, I mean, so I can talk about me personally having been gatekept, and the fact that, every time I get a letter from the council, my heart goes a bit faster, and walking past that offices and the building, I get stressed even now, years and years on. But think actually, so I know so many people that have been gatekept and perhaps don't even realise that that one decision led to over a decade of being trapped in this cycle of supported accommodation to hostel to really poor shared accommodation to back to supported accommodation to stays in mental health wards to all because of that one perverse decision. That person has lost over a decade of their life, and actually all they needed was a home. They weren't asking for anything that they weren't entitled to legally, but because they didn't know that, and to this day, I've sort of gone, you were gatekept, and it's so traumatic that they're like, no, I wasn't. No, the housing officer was right. I'm like, they weren't, but no worries, because you look back at your life and then you've gone, well, I was treated like a child in this supported accommodation, and I was institutionalized for at least 3 years in that supported accommodation, and I've lost out the opportunities to work every day because I love working, or I've lost opportunities to meet friends and have social experiences. So I think, yes, the trauma on an individual basis, and let's not sort of sugarcoat it too much, people die when they're gatekept. People do die from these decisions, but also these sort of decisions last years and years and years, and then sort of cement that fear of, oh God, what happens if I become homeless again? I know the law now, or I know enough to sort of think that I'd be all right. But even to this day, I'm like, don't want to rock the boat too much, just in case I become homeless again and I have to go through that process, because it's terrifying.
It's interesting. One of the comments I got back from someone was, because I kind of asked, well, how feasible it is for someone to challenge it themselves, and first we know for where it's not very feasible, because you need to know quite a lot about the law and also be incredibly assertive, which is not easy in that circumstance. But she was just basically saying that actually, even kind of making any sort of complaint, they know that they may well get treated worse. And I remember working in Bedford Borough Council when someone made a complaint, and you can kind of guarantee they were going to get the worst property available, just almost despite them. There was that kind of laughing and that kind of joking in the office about that sort of effect. And people know it; they're not stupid. They kind of have that intuition to know that if they raise a concern, they run the risk of just kind of having being attacked, basically. And it might seem kind of fantastical for a member of the public to believe that, but I've seen it from the back office point of view of housing officers boasting about it.
Sorry, it's a bit that thing, isn't it, where you've got a roof over your head, what you're complaining about, it's that sort of, it's like that deserving and undeserving. But yeah, it's like as if, you've got a roof, so you should be okay where you are, when in actual fact, some of the places that people are placed in, it is a major safeguarding issue. So
and that's a whole nother issue, actually, which I probably haven't got time to talk about. But I think what's kind of, with Suella Braverman's comments about, people living in a tent is a lifestyle choice. In one sense, that's a natural follow-on from gatekeeping people, and they're not understanding that they don't want to have that fight. They don't want to be in, the people I talked to were talking about, it's like an interrogation. Those interviews are like being interrogated, where you have to justify everything you say is disbelieved, and they're just reluctant to engage. And we talked already about verification, but in one sense, if your outreach team is gatekeeping people by telling them to, you know, go and sleep rough, as in they come to you, they say, I'm rough sleeping, can you help me out? And they say, go and rough sleep and we'll find you and we'll talk about it tomorrow. That's the first experience they have of that service. That is surely going to impact their trust and ability to sort of create some sort of meaningful working relationship with those workers. So again, I think it has a massive impact, you know, on how they trust individual services, but also wider. I think that I've said it elsewhere. I think it's a civil rights issue. It's an issue of a section of society being systematically denied their rights. And I think people feel that, you know, they might not be able to kind of see solidarity and stuff, but they absolutely feel that. And I think that surely that has a knock-on effect to their interest in contributing to society when they've been often kind of, you know, treated incredibly badly to get into that position in the first place.
You also can't win. So, you know, if you go in and you don't know anything about the law and you're really struggling, you're in a really bad place, then it's your fault. It's, you know, your mental health that's caused it, or it's your relationship breakdown that's caused it, or whatever it is. And so you're the blame. And if you go in and go, oh no, actually, I've done a bit of reading and I think I'm entitled to this, or, you know, and you talk like you're a little bit educated perhaps, or whatever it is, then they think you're on the take and they think you're trying to take advantage of the whole system and you're trying to get something that you're not entitled to. So either way, you're not winning.
Yeah. And one of the cases that sticks with me the longer, I mean, what is a case where I was working at Justice where I was never able to secure a genuinely good outcome for them, and the council ended up following the law. But this family had been moved around for 6 years. Youngest kid had never had a settled home. And one thing she said was, no one ever comes knocking for my kids to go and play because we've been moved again. And that impact that has on the kids, different schools, you know, moving around schools all the time, you know, the mum battling school transport teams as well as housing, as well as children's social services and stuff, that there's no way that doesn't massively damage that family member's chance of kind of, you know, paying tax in later life, if you want to kind of take it down to numbers, or being able to kind of thrive and contribute. So that's kind of, I mean, that's a few kind of snapshots of what damage it does to individuals. Gatekeeping, now I might be wrong about this, you guys might tell me wrong about this, but presumably if you gatekeep someone, as Sarah said right at the start, that they're kind of invisible in the stats, you know. And in an interesting FOI we did in Bedford back in 2015, how many households approached the council's housing team in the whole of the year? It was about 1,000. We had to extrapolate a bit because we didn't get the full figures. And how many homeless applications were actually accepted? It was only 400. And of those 600 who were not accepted, we knew some individuals who, you know, we were getting compensation for because they've been treated so badly. So it was very much the case that the more vulnerable you were, the easier it was to gatekeep you. But presumably those figures then went back to central government, who then plan to meet the housing need. And if those figures are hidden, then I'm guessing it leads to insufficient housing being built and insufficient resources being provided. As I say, I don't quite know how those decisions are made, whether central government really knows, you know, what's really going on. I assume they do. I mean, interesting comment we had in the, oh, sorry, Marnie, go on.
No, I was just just when you said that about it, it's sort of, if you you know, underestimating or not reporting the figures properly. I mean, even, you know, because you would get a prevention budget from government, you know, so it's just, you're not going to be getting enough money to deal with the problem. So it's just, you know, it's just, you know, daft really. But
yeah, okay. So for our last section, I guess our question is quite broad. How do we stop it? How can it be stopped? And to answer that question, I want to focus in on different groups of people who are, you know, as I say, kind of have a role to play. And if I start with housing officers, you know, we know the textbook answer is, if you're being told to break the law by your boss, then you should whistleblow. But whistleblowing doesn't work, and it will ruin your life for quite a long time. So what other options do housing officers have? You know, they can quit, but as I say, you know, then the service gets worse. What would we say to housing officers? You know, what can they be doing in those situations? What can they be pushing for? I had a really good bit of feedback from a former senior housing manager, and he said frontline staff need to get really good at quoting law when they push back to their bosses. So, you know, if they get told to gatekeep someone, they just need to send an email with the case law in it. Now, I don't know whether that might lead them to being victimized or targeted for other stuff, but but that's one option. But as I say, what else can teams do? What else can individual housing officers do to kind of push back on this pressure to gatekeep?
I think the one thing that is records is every time a case goes to the GP, every time we go for appeal, get the housing file. Even if there isn't the need to get for the right to see the housing, have a copy of it, quite have it for free.
Sarah, your audio's cutting in and out. Where's your microphone? How close is your microphone to? Because I think that's the issue. Yeah, just hold it up. See if it's better if you hold it up to your face. I don't know how those work. They look technical. That's better. Yeah.
Maybe that's fine. I don't know how much of that you heard. What I was saying was really one thing that housing officers do is keep records. So if we are involved in any sort of litigation, whether it's a judicial review or a housing act appeal or whatever it is, we will get a copy of the housing file. But also you, as individuals, you have a right to see your own housing file, and you've got a right to have it for free. You can request a copy of it. So if you are a housing officer and you are making decisions, why not note on the file, this person appears to be vulnerable. It appears that this. Record your provisional conclusions, record the fact that, record the way that somebody presents to you, record the fact that they appeared very distressed, whatever it is. So I think keeping records is a really good start, because if nothing else, it builds accountability.
Yeah, and so with that, I'd probably add if you come in across a situation that would warrant a safeguarding alert, making sure as a housing officer you're making a safeguarding alert, because you're basically then you're giving other professionals opportunity to push back. With Bedford, it's really interesting because we'd have individual housing officers effectively thank us and say, I can't get this past my boss, but if you can kind of push on it a little bit, we can kind of get a better outcome. But so I like that idea. I think that's something which is probably workable. Unless you've got a nightmare manager, but I think most people would be able to get somewhere with that. So that's really interesting. I mean, I've been recently reading a book about whistleblowing, and it echoes the same thing. It doesn't work, but leaking is something that potentially is more effective. So if you're a housing officer and you're seeing bad stuff happen, you potentially could find someone who is going to be receptive to it and actually leaking pertinent information to them anonymously. Because once within a couple of weeks, Bedford Borough Council had inadvertently exposed my identity, which is not something they should have done. But anyway, I was on the way out anyway. But that's something that if you can remain anonymous, I think it probably safeguards you from the kind of the potential victimization you might get subjected to.
A housing officer, as a housing officer, you could, if you were seeing somebody who was quite vulnerable, ask them to bring in someone who could advocate on their behalf, or go and see someone like Shelter, an organisation who could act on their behalf, because people tend to listen more when there's someone else is involved, who knows the law better than the person who's presenting. So yeah, but also asking for training. I mean, if you're working for a local authority, there's always a training budget, there's always personal development, so it's about asking for the right training as well, so that that you've got the skills to be able to push back and challenge.
And that also gives you permission. So if you've just been on an Equality Act training which said do this, you can say, well, boss, I was told to do this last week in training, so
you need to come on the training.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, is there anything else? So we're all right for time actually, but has anyone else got any sort of things that a housing officer could do in the situation? I'm aware that Tower Hamlets, the housing team, wrote a collective letter to the chief exec, and they leaked it. I'm also told that Edinburgh Council, maybe Edinburgh, I know it's Scotland, but they did something which resulted in the council declaring an emergency. And Scotland, I think they've been on strike at some point as well. So I think it sounds like kind of easy for us to say, but those I think are options. As I say, my own position is, if you're breaking the law and you're clearly hurting people, you just have to stop doing it. And if that means getting a different career, then that's how I would take it. But because otherwise it's just going to keep going, and you're just perpetuating it. But I'm all ears to anyone who kind of disagrees with me on that. It's just that's where I'm at with it. So that's housing officers. I want to just focus now on voluntary sector, so charity workers, advocates, because some of the suggestions will be the same, but some will be different. And I've said it elsewhere as well. The most disheartening thing about my time working at Just Us was when a charity worker would come to us and say, "Oh, this outrageous thing's happening. Can you fix it?" And we're like, "Why can't you fix it? You know, you know how to do it. You know what the law is." And they'd be like, yeah, but I'm funded by the council. It's gonna, you know, we're gonna lose our funding. And I don't know whether that's true or not. And even if they did lose their funding, they'd probably get 2P'd over to the new organisation. But anyway, what can voluntary sector workers, outreach workers, support workers, and so on, what can they be doing about gatekeeping? Giles?
It's a bit tricky. I mean, the first thing is know the law, and I think, you know, potentially accompanying people. Yes, you know, that's great. That's obviously, it's not something that lawyers can do, not least with legal aid. We certainly won't get paid for it. But you know, I think the other thing that voluntary sector perhaps do need to do is to recognise their limits. I mean, one of the things, and I don't know whether Sarah will agree with me, but one of the things we used to see is yeah, they've been trying to persuade, they've been trying to argue with the council, they've been trying to take it on and on and on and on and on, and you actually end up with key time limits being missed to take legal action, because they've, you know, we're just going to argue with them, we're going to persuade them, and it's like, well, no, you've got your 21-day limit here that an appeal has to be lodged or review has to be started. So it's know the law, but know your limits, and find, if you can, given the decreasing number of housing legal aid lawyers, cultivate people to refer to. Because if it's reaching a crunch point where nothing is happening, don't just stick in another angry letter. Find someone who can do something, find someone who's got the legal clout to do something about it. And believe me, councils will, voluntary sector, non-legal bodies can write all the pre-action protocol letters they want. Councils know they can't do anything beyond that, and they'll ignore them. So it's, you know, realise when a lawyering up is necessary, I think is the answer.
And I think I would want to throw that to charity bosses and say, actually, their organisation needs to be intentionally seeking out those relationships with local or even non-local solicitors, anyone really, that can actually kind of provide a function. Because in my mind, a good charity worker can do a lot of the legwork to present a case to a solicitor who can then go and win it and has got the teeth to win it. So that for me seems to be a very plausible way of doing it. Sarah, have you unmuted, or you want to come in, or yeah?
I really wanted to strongly endorse what Tyler says. A lot of the issues that we come across in homelessness, there is only a legal solution. I mean, it's not a solution to the endemic problem, but it's the only solution to that individual's problem. And sometimes the threat is enough. But, you know, very often I am on the phone to a judge late at night in my slippers, trying to get a roof over somebody's head, because actually that is the only thing that is going to make that happen. And the angry letters that are sent by organisations, many times they will work, but many times they won't. And you have to know when you've reached the end of the line, and actually you just need a lawyer and you need to be going to court.
And once you've done that a couple of times, so once you've worked with a solicitor in that way, next time you go to a council and you say, well, I'm going to I'm going to get a solicitor on the case here, they know that you're serious and you can actually do it. And that's you know, so yeah, that's all helpful. I mean, in terms of charities as well, I mean, for me, some of the big charities need to be talking about gatekeeping. There's some really big charities out there, like someone like Homeless Link, who's got some amazing resources on their website, and yet with gatekeeping is largely silent. There's maybe 2 or 3 articles on there that refer to it, but for me, they're leading the sector. They're pushing a lot of good practice out there. They need to be talking about gatekeeping. They need to be putting information out there for frontline staff, and kind of working on suggesting ways to kind of increase those ties with the legal sector. Okay, cool. And with that, I would say as well, so in my mind, if you work in partnership in that way with lawyers and you win a few cases, you can also bang about, you can shout about it with politicians and local councillors and stuff. Because in Bedford with Just Us, we never got as far as using a solicitor, but we always complained. We always kind of took issues to whoever was listening, and that it fell short of being able to get someone TA if they've been denied TA with a silly non-priority decision or something. But but it would kind of lead to, again, more changes, and they would, we'd have a few more teeth to kind of bear if we had an issue. Shannon?
Yeah, so actually we've just had we just had a question for Giles or Sarah in the chat, and it's from a person who works within a charity, and they basically asked, what about Section 202s? Would you suggest, within that charity limits? So I guess even then, when charity workers are informed and they know about Section 202s, which, let's be honest, a lot of charity workers don't, how far are they expected to go? Because I know, legal aid is so difficult to get, lawyers are so difficult to get hold of. So I guess, Giles, not to pick on you, but obviously you said about charities knowing their limits, which I think is also really important from an honesty point of view. What would you sort of say?
Well, I said know the law and know the limits. So, I mean, 202 reviews, perfectly fine if you're reasonably well up on the law, because a lot of the point of crafting a 202 review is knowing what you want to take forward on appeal if and when it's turned down. So, yes, if you're reasonably confident on the law, then yeah, a 202 review is it. But again, how can I put it? Have the solicitor on standby, because you've got your time limits as soon as the review is refused.
Yep. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, there are many 202 reviews that depend on this and on the lawyer. The only issue is that you don't have to try. You have to make all your points. That's the trouble. Otherwise, it comes to me for a potential 204 appeal, and I might think, well, there's this point, but actually no one's raised it. And if no one's raised it, it makes it very difficult for me to raise it on a 204 appeal. So if you're confident, if you think you really know the law, and Mike, for example, you know loads and loads about priority need, especially, and there will be lots of people who've been really, really well up on that and confident to do it. But maybe, understanding where perhaps there's something a bit more tricky and it needs to go to a lawyer at that stage. But there is also the issue of time limits. You've only got 21 days once you've got a review decision to issue an appeal, and that might not be long enough to get a solicitor, get legal aid, and get counsel to put that in. It's a bit tight.
Yeah, I mean, so I've seen Law Stop mentioned in the comments there. I've not worked with them myself, but I've heard that they've got coverage around the country, and I'm assuming they're solicitors, and they would work with people in these kind of situations. But yeah, I think going just to reiterate, charity bosses and frontline workers can all go and take their local solicitor for a coffee and shower them with gifts and get a nice relationship going with them, so they can, when the time comes, they can go straight to them within those time limits.
Don't shower us with gifts. We have to report them.
Noted. Okay, cool.
I wonder, sorry, Mike, just before you move on, I know we're like coming close to the end. I wonder as well, with sort of charity workers, there seems to be almost, yes, they're funded by the local authority, but that individual isn't. And as we've sort of seen through asking questions in the housing committee or freedom of information requests, actually you could almost be doing quite a lot of research into what the problems are. And you could be, at least then telling your clients, right, this is how long the waiting time is for, a 2-bed house. This is this issue, domestic abuse not being recognised because it's Part 6 application. Let's try and get the council's website, re-edited so intentionally homelessness isn't the first thing that comes up when you click I'm homeless. Let's try and do those things. And then who knows, that might have a knock-on effect within the council department and have a bit more of a cultural wider change.
Yeah, I agree. I think as lay people outside the council, we can add to the pressure, which is in reality supporting frontline housing staff to be able to have permission to follow the law and also push for more resources and raise kind of these issues in a way that they just can't. But that's what I'm saying about potentially leaking. A housing officer could feed useful bits of information to a local activist group or whatever community group in order to kind of know what to go after. So I don't want to run over, guys, because you've been very generous with your time. There's one further thing I just want to kind of throw out there in that. We haven't really kind of talked about, what kind of legal sector do, because you're obviously doing, this is your bread and butter. I did an interesting bit, kind of bit of research around LGO upheld complaints and kind of mapped them out on the map of England. And as you would guess, almost all of them are in London, Birmingham, and then a few like Leeds, Manchester, and then interestingly the southeast coast. And you could conclude, well, okay, they must be the areas which are the worst councils. In my experience, and as I say, Shannon and I get around the country doing training, it's the leafy suburb areas that have never been challenged before, which are actually the easiest ones to go after. And I would say that the legal sector could be intentionally kind of working with local groups and local charities or whatever to go after a council and basically just throw the kitchen sink at it. So, win the argument in court, complain about anything that is complained about, take it to the housing committee, do FOIs, take it to the papers, that kind of thing. I think if you were to employ all of those different strands, you could get remarkable turnarounds. And actually, those leafy suburbs are the areas which they're the ones that can actually, they have land to build houses on. So, you can argue with Tower Hamlets all you want to, but you're just banging your head against a brick wall. If you went and took on Central Beds, or, to use them as an example, you might actually see a lot more improvements. But cool. Thank you so much. I just want to kind of spend the last 5 or so minutes just kind of taking any final comments, any sort of summaries or any sort of conclusions you might have reached. The event is titled The Ethics of Gatekeeping. We obviously haven't answered every question on the subject, but it feels like we've had an open discussion. Someone questioned me about saying it's not an open secret, and I'm like, everyone I know knows about it. It seems to me to be an open secret. And LGO decision reports every week suggested it's happening all over the country. But so I just want to leave it just open to everyone, just to sort of say what you think we can move forward with, what's important to bear in mind based on the short discussion. So I don't know if I want to pick on who. Anyone want to go first? No one wants to go first, do they? Oh, Luke, yeah, go on, Luke. Thank you for volunteering.
No. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things Sarah and Shannon have just said, and I think the data recording, keeping records, really, really important. One of the most interesting things we've done a lot of research recently on parent blame and Munchausen's, increasingly having people accused of fabricating illnesses and things like that, and we were sort of trying to work out whether just training, which we talked a lot about, which is really good. I think it's really good, but I think legal training is really crucial. But there's a very interesting initiative in the NHS on autism awareness training, because people with autism present in a way that immediately labels them as difficult and unusual. And we've seen that we produce research to show the systematic discrimination against people with autism. The NHS is spending about £10 million on autism awareness training. And we were speaking to these people about whether it was having an impact, and they were saying, training's great, it's really good. People go training and they come back and they're really enthused, and they turn the computer on and they've got the same form, they've got the same data that Shannon was talking about, the same website, and they then fill out the same form day in, day out. If you really want to change practice, change the computer system. That's the most important thing. Change the questions that staff are required to answer. Like, it must be very distressing to be homeless. It must be very difficult in this situation. You must have health problems. Be kind. And just change the computer system. Training just evaporates after about 3 days once you're back inured in the systems of these organizations. So changing the website so that it, as Shannon says, it doesn't say homeless intentionality and things like that. If you look in the social care for disabled children, it says safeguarding. We're only going to look at you if you're neglect or abuse. So I think that idea about chasing the data, which of course lawyers do, they want that stuff, is really important. And the way, and I think that, so we've made a number of complaints against local authorities because of the way their websites are, you know, the prioritized. Those things you can change, and those things actually can have an impact on culture.
Thanks, Luke. That's really helpful. And yeah, for me, another frustrating thing is when people whinge about an issue in their council or whatever, but they don't do anything about it. And that is something that anyone could do about. You can FOI all the questions that are asked, and you just take it to a housing committee and say, or what, you know, adult social care committee, and just say, this doesn't seem to work. I mean, Shannon did it, literally got it changed in the meeting. Your form doesn't mention disabilities. Can you change it? Yes, we can. 2 minutes. That's presumably going to affect maybe 100 people a year. Who knows? Dead easy. So yeah, thank you, Luke. That's really helpful. Anyone want to go next, or I'll start picking on people?
I was just
go on, Moni. Thanks, Moni.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, yeah, I know we've said how, you know, how difficult a job it is for some caseworkers. We've got some really caring people out there as well, but it's just resources, isn't it, as well? You know, like when I started, 2005, caseworkers, average casework was like 15. Now it's like 60 to 100, isn't it? You know, and you can't expect somebody to be able to spend the time with someone and, you know, do the role that they should be doing as well. So it's about, you know, putting more money into it. And I know that's, you know, councils have been cut to the bone as well, haven't they, over the last years of austerity and everything like that. But you know, for caseworkers to do a good job, they've got to have the resources there.
And I'm sorry I keep like sidetracking to stuff we've done. However, another thing we asked FOI, what's the average caseloads in Bedford? As you say, it used to be 20 to 25, now it's 60. And they picked up on it. They put it on the work programme in the Housing Committee. They've recently been 20 new housing officer positions funded. So it works. And actually, again, that was an FOI or a question that helped the housing officers out, acknowledge that they were in an impossible situation. So anyone can do it. It's really easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Marnie. Sorry to keep going on about it. Shannon?
I don't really have like a closing statement or anything, because like this is still going on. I think it's not a particularly sexy topic for the big charities to sort of campaign. I think for me, if you were to prioritise tackling gatekeeping, then you're making the homelessness application route priority number one. And then that's going to give people far much more autonomy, far much more options, and you're setting them up for a better chance to succeed then, rather than setting people up to fail. And I think working together, co-production, you know, I think I'm a big fan of that. And I think we just need to be listening to how we can help each other. You know, how can we help the housing officers? How can housing officers help the charities? And kind of, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Shannon. Nice one. Sarah?
I think you asked the question that how are we going to solve the problem of gatekeeping, which is quite a major, quite big ask. But I mean, the solution is it's political, local, and national. It's attending housing committee meetings. It's about persuading local authorities, not be central government. It's about how we vote as well, frankly. At the moment, we've got government that apparently thinks that homelessness is a lifestyle issues. So it's about that too. It's about community advocacy, making complaints, making NOI requests, and so on. But it is also about the law, and it's also about using lawyers. And the two big things about the law, and I'm a big advocate for this because I think in this sector it's often thought that lawyers are inaccessible or that the legal route isn't available. And a lot of people just don't even know that it's possible to, as I said earlier, to get on the phone to a High Court judge and ask them to make an order to put a roof over somebody's head. But you can do that. It is possible. And the two big things about using the law are that, firstly, a court can make the local authority do something. Not ask, not persuade, not cajole. It can order the local authority to do something, and it must happen. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, it costs the local authorities money, not just in terms of complying with their duty, but it costs them in legal costs that they have to pay to us. And that means that, A, they don't want to incur those costs, but also, frankly, from you looking to access lawyers, you need to understand gatekeeping cases are the easiest ones we do. They're a walk in the park as a lawyer. The law is dead straightforward. All you've got to do is ask for it and you get the order. And that means that lawyers like me and Giles are very happy to do these cases because we get paid for them. We get paid by the other side. And we will take the local authorities' money very gladly. So don't worry about getting a lawyer. If you can make the connections, you will find lawyers that are willing to do this work because we get paid for it.
Cool. Thanks, Sarah. Nice one. And then last but not least, Giles.
Oh, well, yeah, obviously fund more legal aid housing lawyers because we're running out of us. But I mean, agree with Sarah, but at the moment, I've got a fairly apocalyptic view. I mean, gatekeeping was always bad. It's getting worse. We know the reasons it's getting worse. There's no housing. Yeah, more and more people are losing their homes, and it's not it's increasingly the people who are not stereotypically homeless. It's working people being chucked out of their private sector housing because the landlord wants to sell or wants to put the rent up dramatically. I mean, and this is now the largest single cause. It's there are no affordable homes, full stop, in most areas of the country, not all of them, but most areas of the country. And that has the knock-on effect that councils haven't got anywhere to put anyone. Temporary accommodation is in large parts of the country is almost impossible to find. So the pressures on councils to avoid, and for everything I've said before, this might come as a surprise, but the pressures on council to avoid actually taking on homeless duty to someone who they really can't find anywhere to put are immense. I fully understand the pressures on councils. That does not mean that they get to kick the most vulnerable people in front of them as in response. What's the answer? Well, let's completely change the housing sector, build more social housing, actually deal with the crisis in the private rented sector. Maybe even end Section 21. They keep promising, and it's in front of Parliament now, but they're not going to bring it in until they've changed something or other about the courts that they're not telling us what it is. It's a multifaceted crisis, and I fully understand the pressures on councils. And then there's some in the southeast who never had any problems finding temporary accommodation, and now their budgets have gone up by about 300%, and it's actually putting the council's finances at risk. They just didn't have this problem until about 2 years ago. This is serious. Fully understand this, but unless they stop kicking down and trying to avoid their statutory duties, as long as there are lawyers around, and that's another question because there's fewer and fewer of us all the time, but as long as there are lawyers around, the answer is to keep kicking them until paying out makes it too painful to not to do what they're doing.
Cool. Thanks, Giles, for a realistic assessment. I mean, I'm just going to say one thing, and that is potentially another thing to do to add to the disincentive to gatekeep is not only try and go after them for compensation and costs or whatever, but it's to make it political. So when you have something going on that's wrong, make sure councillors know about it, because they won't know about it. They won't get told about something outrageous that's happened unless you tell them about it, and anyone can do it. So we've gone over. I'm really sorry about that, guys. I was trying my best to get us ended by 9. Thank you so much for your time. I'm hoping everyone on YouTube has found this useful, and if nothing else, has just got people thinking. I appreciate it's a bit of a heavy message. Do stay in contact with us on on the socials in terms of YouTube and Facebook and whatever. And I hope you kind of have space and just time to take this away and think about it, and just talk to your colleagues. Don't do this on your own. It's the worst thing you can do. Get some people who are like-minded around you, because it's slightly less depressing then. But so to all the panelists, I just want to say thank you again so much for giving us your time. I really appreciate it. Found it very interesting. I'm going to be listening to this again myself. I think there's loads in there. And for those guys out there who are in the thick of it, we really hope you can get housed ASAP and as difficult as it is, you know, to sort of see the end of the light, we do hear of people, you know, up against very serious things, and they do get housed, and things do move on, and things do get better. Easy for me to say that, but yeah, yeah, I wish you all the luck you can get, basically. So yeah, thank you very much. We're going to end the live stream there. Panel, if you could just stay on for like 2 minutes, we're just going to do a little